The Rituals of Vlad. Alex sat alone in the castle's library, his hands trembling as they turned the brittle pages of the diary. The air was stagnant and heavy, as though the very walls held their breath while he read. The diary, its leather cover cracked with age, was a window into the past, one that he was beginning to regret opening. The latest entries he uncovered were darker, more frenzied. The handwriting grew erratic, ink staining the pages like blood. It spoke of a council, a secretive group hidden deep within the castle's history, known only as the Blood Court. The words chilled him. The origins of the Blood Court. According to the diary, the Blood Court was formed in the mid-15th century by a cabal of nobles, scholars, and alchemists who served under Vlad Tepes. These were not the men of politics and strategy that history remembered. No, these were something far worse. They were outcasts of society, men and women who had abandoned reason and morality in pursuit of forbidden knowledge. Their purpose was singular: to pierce the veil between the living and the dead. Vlad, already infamous for his ruthless methods and unquenchable thirst for power, became enthralled with their work. The Blood Court promised him the impossible: immortality, a way to escape the fragility of life and rule forever. The diary entries described how the Blood Court took residence in the hidden depths of Bran Castle, beneath the chapel and far from prying eyes. There, under Vlad's command, they performed rituals that twisted the very fabric of nature. They speak in tongues not meant for human mouths. One entry read, "And offer blood to that which waits beyond." The air grows heavy with their chants, and the walls groan under the weight of what they summon. Alex shuddered, glancing nervously at the shadows that pooled in the corners of the library. Despite the sunlight filtering faintly through the castle windows, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Vlad's obsession. As Alex read further, he saw how Vlad's obsession consumed him. The Count, already a man of terrifying reputation, began to retreat from his court and his people, spending days, sometimes weeks, deep within the castle's hidden chambers. The Blood Court served him faithfully, but their loyalty came at a price. He grows distant, one of the entries read. His eyes no longer see us. They look through us. He speaks of visions, of a shadow that whispers to him in the dark. He claims the shadow has shown him the path to eternal power. The shadow. Alex's hand tightened on the diary, the phrase stirring memories of his own visions. The gaunt figure with burning red eyes. The suffocating darkness that had followed him since he first touched the bloodstone. The diary grew darker from there. The scribe, whoever they were, wrote of sacrifices, bodies brought to the Blood Court, their screams echoing through the stone halls. Vlad, once a man of flesh and blood, was now something else entirely. The Count has taken to the rituals himself. He stands at the altar, blade in hand, as though he were a priest of some infernal god. The blood flows freely, and the shadow grows stronger. We dare not speak against him, for he knows our thoughts before we do. This place has become a tomb. The grotesque rituals. Alex turned another page, his stomach churning as he read the grim details of the rituals. Each ceremony began with the spilling of blood, always fresh, always human. Victims were dragged into the depths of the castle, where the Blood Court gathered in silence. At the center of their chamber was an altar of black stone, carved with ancient symbols. Atop the altar sat the bloodstone, the diary described, glowing faintly as though it hungered for the life offered to it. The diary spoke of how the rituals began simply: a single victim, a prayer, and a chant spoken in an indecipherable tongue. But as the Blood Court's influence grew, so too did their cruelty. They offer more each night: prisoners, peasants, even the children. The stone demands it. The Count watches as the blood fills the channels carved into the altar, and he laughs, a hollow, joyless sound. His face is no longer his own. It is a mask of shadows. Alex swallowed hard, while rising in his throat as he imagined the scenes. The idea of human sacrifice had always felt like a grotesque relic of distant history, but the diary described it in such vivid, personal detail that it was impossible to dismiss. The rituals were not mere superstition. They were real. Madness takes hold. The diary entries grew more fragmented as the writer described Vlad's descent into madness. The Count, once a man feared for his brutal but calculated methods, had become something else entirely, inhuman, possessed. The Count no longer eats or sleeps. One entry read, "He disappears for days, and when he returns, he speaks in riddles." He claims the Bloodstone has shown him the truth, that he has glimpsed the face of eternity. But his voice is no longer his own. It is hollow, like the echo of a scream in a deep well. The writer's growing terror bled through the pages. They described hearing noises deep within the castle, scraping sounds, inhuman whispers, and guttural breathing. The shadow moves among us now. It does not hide. I see its form lingering in doorways, its red eyes watching us from the dark. It is not the Count who commands us anymore. It is the thing we have summoned. We are its servants, its slaves. Alex sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. He wiped the sweat from his brow, unable to stop his hands from shaking. Vlad's story was no longer the legend of a cruel warlord. It was a nightmare of his own making, a horror birthed from his desperate quest for power. A final warning. As Alex reached the final pages of the diary, the tone shifted from horror to despair. The writer knew they were doomed. The rituals had gone too far. The Blood Court's power had grown too great, and Vlad himself had become a vessel for something beyond human comprehension. "We cannot stop it," the diary read. "The Count has given himself fully to the shadow, and the Bloodstone is its beating heart. The castle is alive now. It breathes, it watches. There is no escape. Those who enter this place are bound to it forever." The last entry was brief, written in a shaky hand. "To whoever finds this, leave. Leave before it sees you, before it knows your name. It waits, and it will not be denied." The castle reacts. As Alex closed the diary, the silence in the library seemed heavier than before, as though the walls themselves were listening. He let out a shaky breath, the weight of what he had read sinking in. He glanced at the window, where the light was already fading. Outside, the sky had turned a dull gray, storm clouds gathering over the mountains. The Bloodstone, the shadow, the sacrifices. He thought of the visions that had plagued him. The rituals, the weeping victims, the Watcher. The diary had confirmed his worst fears. Vlad and the Blood Court had awakened something ancient and hungry. And now it knew him. A sudden thud broke the silence. Alex jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. He spun around, his eyes darting across the library. One of the books had fallen from the shelf, landing open on the stone floor. Alex rose slowly, his legs unsteady as he approached the book. It was open to an illustration, an image of a man standing before an altar, the bloodstone glowing in his hands. Shadows swirled around him, twisting into monstrous shapes with red eyes. Alex felt a chill crawl down his spine. He glanced around the room again, the shadows seeming darker now, deeper. He swore he saw movement in the corner of his eye, a flicker of something that vanished when he turned his head. The castle was awake, and it was watching him. The hidden path. The castle seemed to grow colder as Alex descended the narrow spiral staircase beneath the chapel. He had found the entrance by accident, or so he thought. A draft from the base of the altar had caught his attention, drawing his flashlight beam to a seam in the floor that betrayed a hidden door. Beneath it, carved into the stone, he had discovered the passage. Now, as he moved deeper underground, the air became heavier, rank with the metallic tang of old blood and decay. Each step echoed ominously against the rough stone walls, the sound amplified in the suffocating silence. The flashlight in his hand flickered slightly, and he shook it, the beam steadying but never feeling strong enough to push back the surrounding darkness. "Why am I doing this?" Alex muttered to himself. His voice felt intrusive, out of place, as though the walls might hear him. The seer's words echoed in his mind. "Leave this place. It does not sleep, it waits." But Alex couldn't turn back. Not yet. The diary had hinted at a burial ground beneath the castle, where the Blood Court had disposed of their sacrifices. The cryptic words had haunted him. Beneath the earth they rest, but not in peace. What had they done? What had they buried here? The catacomb revealed. At the base of the staircase, Alex found himself in a narrow tunnel, its walls damp and glistening. Roots poked through the cracks, tangled and black like veins threading through diseased flesh. The hum that had followed him ever since he touched the bloodstone was faint here, but it was still present, like a distant, beating heart. The passage widened as he walked, and the ground sloped downward. Soon he stood at the entrance to a vast chamber. He swept his flashlight over the space, and what he saw made his breath catch. The walls of the chamber were lined with alcoves, each one filled with skeletal remains. The bones were yellowed and brittle, piled haphazardly or propped against the walls. Some skulls had fallen to the ground, their hollow eye sockets staring into nothing. In the center of the room, a massive stone pillar rose to the ceiling. Its surface was covered in carvings, grotesque figures contorted in agony, spirals of symbols that matched the markings he had seen in the hidden room with the bloodstone. Alex stepped forward, the beam of his flashlight darting across the ground. More bones littered the floor, along with rusted chains, decaying fabric, and tools he didn't want to identify. He swallowed hard, his stomach churning at the sheer scale of the atrocity that had been committed here. "This is impossible," he whispered. "Markings on the dead." Alex knelt beside one of the larger piles of bones, his flashlight illuminating a cluster of skulls. At first glance, they seemed unremarkable, until he noticed the markings. Each skull had been carved with intricate symbols. The spirals and jagged lines mirrored the patterns he had seen before. But here they were etched into bone, precise and deliberate. Some markings were filled with what looked like a dark red resin, long dried but still glistening faintly. Alex's fingers hovered over the carvings. The symbols seemed to hum under his touch, as though they retained some fragment of the rituals that had been performed here. He pulled back sharply, his breathing quickening. These people hadn't just been sacrificed, they had been marked. The blood court hadn't treated them as mere victims. They had become part of something larger, their deaths feeding into whatever dark force Vlad and his council had summoned. God, Alex breathed, standing abruptly and backing away. The child-sized skeleton. Then he saw it. At the far end of the chamber, beneath a smaller alcove, lay a skeleton unlike the others. It was smaller, child-sized. The bones were arranged carefully, almost reverently, as though whoever had placed them there had done so with ritualistic purpose. Alex's flashlight trembled in his hand as he approached, dread pooling in his stomach. The bones were pristine, unnervingly so. Unlike the others, they hadn't yellowed with age. In fact, they looked fresh. And then he saw the runes. The same symbols etched into the skulls were carved into the child's ribcage and femurs, glowing faintly with a reddish light. Alex's breath hitched. The light pulsed softly, as though the symbols were alive, breathing in time with some unseen rhythm. He knelt down slowly, his mind racing. How could the markings still glow? The diary spoke of rituals meant to bind power, to feed the bloodstone. But this child... He looked at the small skull, the hollow sockets seeming to watch him. A sick realization washed over him. This had been recent. Impossible, he muttered, shaking his head. This isn't possible. The presence awakens. The hum returned, louder now, vibrating through the stone floor. Alex felt it crawl up his spine, rattling his bones. The flashlight flickered again, its beam faltering. A sudden thud echoed behind him. Alex spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Something had moved. The bones near the entrance to the chamber had shifted, tumbling to the ground in a cascade of hollow clattering. Alex swept his flashlight across the space, but saw nothing. Only more shadows stretching impossibly long against the walls. The hum grew louder still, rising to a low, guttural drone. Alex's chest tightened as the air around him grew heavier, colder. The walls seemed to press inward, the carvings on the central pillar writhing like living things under the flickering light. Then he heard it, a breath, wet, labored, right behind him. Alex turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The shadow in the catacomb. A figure stood at the edge of the chamber, half shrouded in darkness. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its back hunched, as though the weight of the world had bent it. Its skin was pale and stretched thin over its bones, and its face, Alex's throat tightened, was an impossible mixture of human and something far worse. Its eyes were the worst of all, twin pinpricks of red light, burning with an ancient, malevolent hunger. The hum in the chamber became a roar, vibrating through Alex's skull as the figure stepped forward. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it were unused to the body it inhabited. Alex stumbled backward, his foot catching on a stray bone. He hit the ground hard, his flashlight skidding away. The beam spun wildly, casting chaotic flashes of light across the catacomb. The figure moved closer, its breathing ragged and inhuman. Alex scrambled to his feet, his hands searching desperately for something, anything, that could protect him. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate. Then it raised one clawed hand, and the markings on the child's bones flared brighter, the red light spilling across the chamber. Alex felt the energy surge toward him, an unseen force that slammed into his chest and sent him sprawling against the stone pillar. The carvings dug into his back as he gasped for air, pain shooting through his ribs. Narrow escape. The figure took another step, its form a shifting blur at the edge of his vision. Alex's mind screamed at him to move, to run, ignoring the searing pain in his chest. He pushed himself up and lunged for the flashlight. The beam steadied as he gripped it, and he swung it toward the figure. The light struck the creature, and it recoiled violently, letting out a shriek that shook the walls. Alex didn't wait. He ran. Bones cracked and splintered under his feet as he sprinted toward the exit, the creature's howls echoing behind him. The passage seemed longer now, twisting and shifting like a living thing trying to trap him. Finally, he reached the spiral staircase, his legs burning as he climbed. The sound of the creature faded, but the hum lingered, vibrating through the stone. Alex burst into the chapel, his lungs heaving. The altar loomed before him, the hidden door sliding shut behind him with a deep thud. He fell to his knees, clutching the talisman around his neck. The faint red glow from the catacomb still lingered behind his eyes, and he knew one thing for certain. The sacrifices weren't just in the past. The blood court's work wasn't over. The voices below. The chapel was unnervingly silent after Alex slammed the hidden door shut behind him. His breathing came in ragged gasps, his back pressed against the cold stone. He clutched the talisman around his neck, its sharp edges digging into his palm. The memory of what he had seen in the catacomb lingered. The glowing runes on the child-sized skeleton, the grotesque figure, its glowing red eyes, and the ancient power that had nearly consumed him. The silence didn't last long. Faint whispers began to seep through the cracks in the floor beneath him, drifting up like smoke. At first, Alex thought they were nothing but the echo of his rattled nerves. But as they grew louder, he realized they were real. The whispers surrounded him, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words were unintelligible, spoken in a tongue that sounded ancient and unnatural. The voices overlapped, deep, guttural murmurs mingling with higher-pitched, trembling whispers. The sound crawled into his ears and coiled around his mind, burrowing deeper the longer he listened. Alex staggered to his feet, his head pounding. "Stop it," he whispered hoarsely, as though pleading with the voices would do any good. But they didn't stop. They grew louder. The chant begins. The whispers shifted, becoming rhythmic, deliberate, like a chant. Though Alex couldn't understand the words, their cadence struck him as unmistakably ceremonial. It was the same language he had heard in his dreams, the same guttural tones that accompanied the rituals he had seen in his visions. He spun in a slow circle, his flashlight beam darting across the chapel walls. The air felt heavier now, as though it carried the weight of centuries. The carvings on the altar seemed to shimmer faintly in the light, their lines twisting and pulsing as though alive. From beneath him, the voices rose to a crescendo. It was no longer just a sound. It was a force, vibrating through the stone floor and into Alex's bones. The very walls of the chapel seemed to hum in response, a deep resonance that made his teeth ache. Appariator, tenebris, The phrase came clearly through the cacophony, spoken by a single voice that was impossibly deep and close. Alex froze. The words sent a jolt of recognition through him. He had read them in the diary. Open to the darkness. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The whispers paused, as though holding their breath. Then they returned all at once, louder, furious, and desperate. "Aperiator tenebris." The words reverberated through the chapel, shaking the walls. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the ground beneath Alex's feet trembled. The hidden door appears. Alex staggered backward, his flashlight flickering wildly in his trembling hand. He stumbled as the vibrations intensified, and that was when he saw it. On the far wall of the chapel, a door. It hadn't been there before. At first, Alex thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but as he focused on it, the door became clearer, a narrow outline carved into the stone, its edges faintly glowing red. The whispers shifted again, as though encouraging him, calling him toward it. "Aperiator tenebris." "No," Alex whispered, shaking his head. "No, this can't be real." The voices didn't care. They grew louder, more frantic, the overlapping chants crashing into one another like waves in a storm. The pressure in Alex's skull became unbearable, a stabbing pain that made him double over. Anything to make it stop. Clutching the talisman tightly, Alex stumbled toward the door, crossing the threshold. The stone was unnaturally smooth as Alex pressed his palm against it. The moment he touched it, the red glow flared, and the stone shifted beneath his hand. The outline deepened, and with a low, grinding rumble, the door slid inward, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. The air that rushed out of the opening was ice cold and carried the faint, sickly sweet smell of decay. Alex recoiled instinctively, but the whispers grew louder, now coming from inside the passage. "Aperiator tenebris." He had no choice. The voices were driving him mad. He couldn't stay in the chapel. He couldn't turn back. Taking a deep breath, Alex stepped through the hidden door. The passage closed behind him with a dull thud. The passage below. The darkness here was absolute. Alex's flashlight cut a thin beam through the void, but it only illuminated a few feet ahead. The walls were smooth and damp, the narrow corridor stretching forward like the throat of some great beast. The air was colder the further he walked, his breaths forming faint clouds in the beam of his light. The whispers followed him, bouncing off the stone walls, growing fainter and more insistent at the same time, as though something deeper in the darkness was whispering back. Alex moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing unnaturally. The sound didn't just come from beneath him. It seemed to come from all around, like dozens of feet walking just out of sight. He paused to steady himself, shining the light down the corridor. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a shadow flitting across the edge of the beam. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. No answer, just the whispers. The symbols returned. After what felt like an eternity, the passage widened into a circular chamber. The ceiling arched high above him, lost in the darkness, and the walls were covered in carvings, symbols like the ones he had seen in the hidden room and the catacomb. Spirals and jagged lines twisted across every inch of the stone, their patterns disorienting, as though they might come alive if he stared too long. In the center of the room was a pedestal. Alex's blood ran cold as he approached. On the pedestal sat an object, a second box, smaller than the one in the hidden room, but no less ornate. Its dark wood was covered in the same carvings, and faint tendrils of red light pulsed from the seams, as though the box itself were breathing. The hum returned louder now, vibrating through the chamber. Alex felt it in his chest, his ribs rattling with each pulse of the sound. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "Not again." But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, rising to a deafening roar. "Aperiator tenebris." The force unleashed. As Alex backed away, the box began to tremble. The red glow flared brighter, spilling across the floor like blood. The carvings on the walls pulsed in time with the light, the symbols twisting and writhing like living things. The air grew impossibly heavy. Alex fell to his knees, clutching the talisman as though it might anchor him to reality. Then the voices stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a deep, guttural breath echoed through the chamber. Alex looked up. From the walls, the darkness shifted. Shadows slithered across the carvings, coalescing into a form that Alex recognized. A gaunt figure with elongated limbs and burning red eyes. It emerged from the stone itself, as though the castle had spat it out, its claws scraping against the floor as it advanced. The hum became a roar, vibrating through Alex's skull as he scrambled to his feet. He escaped. Alex ran. He didn't think. He just moved, his flashlight swinging wildly as he sprinted back into the passage. The hum followed him, the force pressing against his back like unseen hands pushing him forward. The whispers returned, frantic and furious, echoing through the corridor like a chorus of screams. The darkness felt alive now, clawing at him as he ran. He could feel the creature behind him, its presence a cold weight on his shoulders. Finally, he reached the end of the passage. The stone door loomed ahead, slightly ajar. Alex shoved it open and stumbled into the chapel, collapsing onto the stone floor as the door slammed shut behind him with a thunderous boom. The whispers stopped. The hum was gone. Alex lay there for a long moment, gasping for breath, his hands still clutching the talisman. The castle was silent once more, but he knew better than to trust it. Whatever lay beneath the earth had awakened, and it wasn't finished with him yet.